Okay, good morning, folks. Thank you, Kai. It's a pleasure to be here. I'd like to begin by thanking you for your attendance here this morning when you could be getting lost in the bird's nest or in the Forbidden City or, let's be honest, anywhere in Beijing. So it's nice to be here. Thank you very much. Perhaps the best place to start in a conference of this kind is with a sense of context. As a sociologist of sport, and having looked through the program, I'm not entirely sure, however, how many sociologists there are in the audience. Can I ask anybody who professes publicly to be a sociologist to raise your hand? One or two people only. I think the point that I'm leading towards is that these generic sorts of conferences come with pluses and minuses. On the plus side, it's delightful to be in the presence of so many people representing so many disciplines with so much diverse and eclectic, even esoteric experience in the world of sport. The disadvantage, of course, the flip side, is that very few people understand the particular discipline or sub-discipline that you represent. With that in mind, just a word of caution about the presentation to follow. I am a sociologist of sport, and relative to many other sub-disciplines in sport study, sociologists are seen as the Grinch of sport study, the people who often have what appear to be negative as opposed to positive things to say. I'm not sure that that's particularly fair, but we certainly do have critical things to say about the world of sport, and you'll hear some of them in the next 15 minutes or so. Where the title of the paper is concerned, the paper certainly addresses the issue of sport for all, or the catchphrase that's been used for the past decade or two at this point, sport and social development, or sport for peace. I want to acknowledge that in the sociology of sport at least, while in this particular discipline, sport and race, sport and violence, sport and gender, sport and children, these sorts of sub-disciplinary fields have been flourishing for decades, for a very long time. The work on sport and social development is relatively new. As such, it's not particularly robust, and in addition to not being particularly robust, it's very fractious. Different people disagree on their particular perspectives, on where we're at, and what needs to be done. In the paper that I'll give in the next 13 or 14 minutes, what I will do is give you a snapshot, an overview of the work that I've been involved in over the last decade or thereabouts on sport and social development. And in particular, I will report on case studies from African countries and from Cambodia, and I will lead towards the general conclusion that whereas we have many case studies and there is a bird's nest filled with reports and inquiries out there, there is a relative paucity when it comes to good, reliable sport for development impact tools available. So my general conclusion is going to be that there is this massive imbalance between the work that's being done and ways of evaluating the work that's being done. I'm not going to read what Kofi Annan said several years ago in 2002 in relationship with the Salt Lake City Games, but you've all read this very famous quote, often cited quote many times. Suffice it to say that this sort of phraseology that, with respect, you find in most of the sports-related disciplines is uplifting, it's hopeful, and it has a purpose. As a sociologist of sport, intellectually, I understand that there is a place of sport in the community. It's one of our most important social institutions. Personally, I played varsity rugby on both sides of the Atlantic. I coached for 20 years. I have children involved in sport. And I probably have much the same biography of many of you in terms of my personal history in sport. I teach classes on sociology of sport and have done at the University of Calgary for over 20 years. I have hope. But I think there's a difference between being hopeful about sport and being naive about sport. And with respect, the sorts of images that you may have seen recently about the world of sport, in a sense, remove innocent children from the experience that they will be exposed to later on in life. It might be religion, it might be sexuality, it might be poverty, it might be politics, it might be war, it might be some form of abuse. And sociologists of sport are interested in realistically measuring the role of sport for all in difficult situations. So, at the bottom of this overhead, you'll see that I suggest that I'm going to look at my own experiences from Kenya and Burundi and Cambodia, and basically ask the question, what evidence do we have that the claims, the rather cavalier claims that people are making in the sports community, that sport for peace and sport for development works? What is the general sweep of evidence from all cultures? And I'd like to suggest that there is, in many respects, an evidence vacuum when it comes to proof, when it comes to evidence. Finally, before I leap into these case studies, I think it's also very important to have a sense of proportion and a sense of scale with respect to the work that we do, because measuring the role of sport in the largest slum in Africa is completely different than measuring the impact of the Pan Am Games in Toronto. And I'll address these things. I think it's fair to say that there has been an academic groundswell in the sociology of sport that makes complete sense when it comes to the role of sport for peace and sport for all. Colleagues of ours in the sociology of sport are doing, I would say, critical, not just interesting, but critical work bringing Palestinian and Israeli kids together. Colleagues in the sociology of sport are doing important work in African countries and Asian countries. And literally hundreds, if not thousands, of reports and case studies are available. And these have cost literally in the hundreds of millions of dollars and perhaps more. In Canada, as with, no doubt, in your countries, there are reasons for optimism in terms of, well, let's measure this, and what do we know about the legacy that sport leaves behind? We know, for instance, at the University of British Columbia, at UBC, that there is a sustainability centre that takes very seriously the role of sport in difficult communities where abuse is rampant and rife. And we know at the University of Toronto that the U of T will take as seriously as any other institution on the planet the Pan Am Games in 2015. Not only in terms of whether or not kids get to play, but whether or not kids will get to play in the city of Toronto for 15 or 35 years to come, which surely is about a long-term footprint. So there is this sort of work being done, and these are just simply some images from the city of Toronto, which I'm suggesting is taking sport for all as seriously as any of the cities I know right now in the sociology of sport community. The sobering thought is that this is not the first time that this sort of work has been done, and these sorts of words have been used. A well-known Canadian journalist, for instance, writing about Winnipeg, offered some sobering thoughts. He wrote, Winnipeg has twice hosted the Pan Am Games in 1967 and 1999, and well, Winnipeg is still Winnipeg. The city hasn't really changed, and in certain respects there's an argument to be made that it's worse as opposed to better. So let's be proportionate and let's have a sense of scale in talking about the sorts of claims that we often hear in the world of sport. Two very fast case studies, because I know we only have 15 minutes in total before Kai gets aggressive. On your left-hand side, you see a kid that I met in Kibera. Kibera is the largest slum in Africa, and it's based just outside of Nairobi. The image on the right is a soldier, a military man in Burundi, just out of Gitega, outside of Bujumbura in Burundi. And I want to talk about these people over the next few seconds. In 2007, with some colleagues, I visited Nairobi to conduct some work on soccer for peace and soccer for social development in one of the most difficult climates on the planet, in the largest slum by population in Africa, in Kibera. And we took to Kibera both sport goals, athletic goals, and social goals. I apologize up front, folks, but you'll be able to empathize with me when I say that I can't go through every word on these slides for reasons of timing. 15 minutes isn't very long. But we had a number of possible goals and motives in mind when we traveled to Kibera. These were both athletic and social. This work was only possible with the help of certain guides. It was only possible with people, quote unquote, on the ground. We were forced to, but I have to, with respect, argue that we did not want to go through Right to Play. I apologize if you're Right to Play. We needed to go through World Scouts Bureau, based in Africa. Otherwise, we simply wouldn't have had safe access to people on the ground, and we were also representing our institution. The only point that I want to take out of this current slide is that in Kibera, in Nairobi, we're faced with a particular set of problems. As you'll see from the slide I'll show you in a few seconds' time. In fact, let me just directly skip to it. You'll see that testing the Pan Am Games in Toronto on things like transportation, children in schooling, obesity, these sorts of issues that you've heard about this morning and elsewhere, completely different in this sort of setting. Very quickly, what you see moving from top left in a clockwise direction, this is the largest slum of Africa taken from the air, which moves across to one of the leisure facilities, the Kibera Pub. Further down, this is where flying toilets, as they call them on the ground, take place, where there's no sort of bathroom facilities that you and I have the luxury of taking advantage of. And the bottom left, this is an average main street in Kibera. You can imagine that this is a community that faces particular sorts of problems where abuse, safety, HIV, health, and other things are concerned. Kicking a soccer ball is, quite frankly, a luxury to these people. We hosted and participated in a series of soccer competitions in fairly dire conditions, and we liaised with a series of businesses which look like sweatshops, but in fact they're responsible for very good and I think civil philanthropic work in the distribution of certain messages and certain resources around Africa. We also visited Burundi, and in Burundi we had a completely different set of experiences altogether. Whereas in Kibera, we were able to liaise with Scouts Kenya and Scouts Africa in a really successful way, and are still in touch with Kibera and Scouts and coaches on the ground in terms of fostering our Soccer for Peace program. In Bujumbura and Gitega in Burundi, we were faced with a completely different set of circumstances. We were faced with what the rest of the world was telling us was a now defunct, a now concluded civil war, which we found not to be the case. We were faced with ethnic violence and military problems, and we were told no every time we asked a question. The only slide on this that I'd like to bring to your attention is the one on the bottom left of these Burundi kids who are trying to sell us maize, or what they call is yellow chocolate. And this is a luxury to them, and I think that you can see clearly enough the sense of desperation on their faces. This, believe it or not, is where Hope and Agenda is concerned, is the National Training Center in Gitega in Burundi. So whereas, despite the fact that in Kibera, the conditions, the playing conditions were still atrocious, you can see from these photographs that the National Training Center in Gitega in Burundi has hardly ever been used. And you can see on the bottom right that this little girl, who I took a photograph of from a shepherd's family, on the so-called soccer pitch in the National Training Center in Gitega in Burundi, has absolutely nothing to do with my life, or vice versa. And then we come to, very quickly, to Cambodia. I'm also involved in similar sorts of work in northwestern Cambodia in Siem Reap, in one of the poorest communities in Cambodia. I want to quickly skip to the conclusions, because it's more of a discussion sort of section, and to be provocative, I would like to make some arguments about support for development work. I'd like to make three sets of conclusions. The first set of conclusion has to do with what we're actually doing when we go into the communities, whether it's a school or a country, and certainly what we're doing when we take it upon ourselves to go into Gitega or Kibera. And sociologically and politically, I want to make the case that what we're not doing is only shaping sport. I think if we're honest, we're trying to shape the community. In a sense, what sociologists call shaping is policing. I don't mean this in a totalitarian or political sort of way, but shaping in a choreographing or manipulating of the community. And there are three different ways we can do this. Do we shape or help shape communities in an empire sort of way, by imposing our views on the insiders? Or do we ask for cooperation from those on the inside and behave like the Brits do where football hooliganism and spotters is concerned, by trying to police the problem by asking the hooligans to help us police themselves? Or do we allow it to run freely in a self-governing sort of way? Whatever work you're involved in, if you're involved in sport for all, you are involved in one of these three different models in one way or another. So empire building and hegemony from the sociological point of view simply means structures of dominance, cooperation and participation, or a self-governance sort of model. We're all likely involved in at least one of these models. A second set of conclusions. The buzzword on almost every campus, certainly in the West these days, is globalization and internationalization. And what's amazing about globalization and internationalization is when you actually tackle administrators and senior university staff about what these mean, they can't tell you. They don't know the difference between globalization and Japanization or Americanization. They can very rarely tell you. We have to be very cautious in making cases of internationalization or globalization. They're not necessarily the same thing. And I think that lots of the work that's being done here has as much to do with campus politics, selling the reputation of a certain university, as it does with work with integrity on the ground. Where the role of local knowledge is concerned, without local Trojan horses, and this brings us back to this last slide, this sort of work is impossible without local people on the ground to continue the work after we've gone. As John from Kibera, who was 17 and the soccer coach, told me as I was about to board the plane, and I quote, "I knew that you would leave. I knew that you wouldn't stay." So the question is, why would they welcome us in the first place? Once again, there are very context-specific problems. Dealing with Kenya and Burundi is completely different than dealing with Cambodia, and different than dealing with Calgary or with Toronto. I see around me tons of what I call popcorn sociology that's simply popping up. It's popping, it's effervescing, it's bubbling, but it doesn't really have staying power. And one wonders whether or not these micro-projects have any integrity in the long term. And the last point from this, because I need to conclude soon, this slide that I'd like to talk about is a misdirected sociology of sport, and whether or not we're in the business of is the development of an academic empire without actually changing the communities on the ground. What we saw in earlier papers with respect and other presentations at this conference, in fact the essence of a World Sport for All conference, suggests that we need to do something about these sorts of images. What I can tell you is that the kids on the left, and they look like troublemakers, let's be honest, they stole my camera and they stole my wallet in Kibera. I don't really have a problem with that, because the truth is I can afford to buy another. But let's not be naive about what kids involved in sport do. Once they're corrupted by the community around them, once their culture, religion, race, sexuality, age, etc., affects them, sport is not necessarily the pure thing that we've seen previously. And then on the right we see the image of the young girl, and I think, what am I even doing as a sociologist of sport? Why am I even trying to sell sport to somebody who can't find grain?
Well, I'm not getting aggressive, Kevin, but you've got a maximum of 1 minute from now on.
Okay, no problem. Much like your own communities and much like your own disciplines, the sociology of sport is doing good, responsible, ethical work on sport and social development and on sport for peace. This work is simply massive. It could fill the bird's nest. It's not small. It's considerable. It spans across every sociology of sport department in the West at least, and I suspect increasingly in the East. But let me finish this way. If you asked any sociologist of sport, what are your top, best, go-to 3 sources on sport and violence, any good sociologist of sport would tell you. If you asked her, what are your best 3 sources on sport and race, she would tell you. If you asked any good sports medical doctor, what's the connection between racing and knee or leg injuries, they would tell you. If you asked anybody in the sociology of sport, what are your best 3 tools for measuring the long-term impact of sport, they wouldn't know where to begin. Thank you very much.
A very compressed